basics. So we discussed the basic takeaways, and those are a little bit the more complicated things that usually work. One thing is that in ecosystems that are just starting out, it makes a lot of sense for the government to invest, actively invest. I do want to say that it can be extremely problematic and the ROI is going to be probably negative, meaning the government is not going to profit from those investments. But sometimes when there are no investors in an ecosystem, and it happens in many, many locations, the government has to be the one kind of pushing and allocating the initial capital. It happens, by the way, a good example is in Russia. That currently has a problem with investors, so the government is helping actively startups with accelerator programs and so on, and also funding them a little bit. So the idea is that when you're not a mature ecosystem, giving a little bit of financial aid to startup founders makes sense, especially if they're building complex products that involve a lot of research and development. Later on, in later stages, when the ecosystem is mature, you should probably avoid government investing money. And if you do that, only do that with matching elements of private investors put 500K and then the government put 500K. That's something that happens still in Israel, but I'm honestly against it. I think it's not worthwhile. If the ecosystem is mature, you should just give it to the private market. Governments can also give investor benefits, for example, tax breaks and so on to investors so they can invest more. Again, if the ecosystem is not mature, it makes sense. The third one is the one I probably like the most. If you don't have ecosystem co-working places in your ecosystem, it's very much worthwhile for the government to build a co-working space, one or two, at least one in the city, and make it free until the ecosystem arrives a certain level of maturity. So I'm just saying it as clear as it is. If there are no co-working spaces in a city, the government has a responsibility of building one and just wait for the private ones to come and then close it. But they have to be kind of the first one, or at least support the current co-working spaces. Co-working spaces are a hub of innovation, and they create a situation in which founders are not stuck at home, but meet other founders. So they're absolutely critical for the ecosystem. Co-working spaces are not receiving the amount of, let's say, importance with governments that they should. And I'm hoping that this situation is going to change. Governments are also sometimes giving free business consultation to entrepreneurs. This one I like less, I have to admit, because I have a feeling that if you're a founder and you need a government to give you some business advice, then don't start a business anyway. But that's on my view. Many people are not in agreement with it, but that's something to consider, and governments are doing that. One thing that is very, very important is to invest more in the cities that are left behind. So, for example, I've seen that we have a few people in Canada here. So the idea is that if you're the central government of Canada, investing in Montreal, Vancouver, and Toronto doesn't make a lot of sense. Or if you're in the UK, investing in the London startup ecosystem does not make a lot of sense, but investing in the smaller cities makes a lot of sense. So that's kind of like the idea of the government to promote let's say the underdogs that are currently not in the forefront, because the government wants to make sure that not all the local talent is drifting into one city. By the way, it's happening specifically in the UK, and that's the biggest problem that we identified in the UK. London is ranked very, very high in the global startup ecosystem, but then Manchester is second, and it's very low. So the idea is that the distribution is problematic. If you compare this to Canada, you have Toronto, Montreal, and which one I'm forgetting? Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver. So they're very much distributed, almost equal, and very, very strong. In the UK, you only have London, and that's not a good situation. So, for example, the English government should probably invest a lot more in Manchester and in Portsmouth and so on and so on. More things that can help is making visa rules easier for entrepreneurs. So now teams are global, and if you're making it very difficult to receive a visa, it's going to have a bad effect on the startup ecosystem, and that's something important to think about. One more thing to do at a younger age, which is critical, is put English high on the education list, dedicate a lot of efforts to make sure that your young population speaks English. If they don't, there is virtually no hope of success. So that's something to think about. And by the way, you can see a country like Japan, for example, probably one of the most innovative countries out there that did not really manage to do that well on startups. And my main, let's say, concern about Japan and my reason for that is that there is a problem in the English level. So I'm pretty sure that if Japan had better English level, it would have been much, much higher. One more thing that works perfectly is to encourage international corporations to build local centers in your country. That worked amazingly well for Israel. Israel is the center of development for Intel, for example, and other companies like Google, Microsoft also have very, very big centers in Israel. So the idea is that if you manage to persuade the big guys to arrive and to build center of R&D in your country, you're doing amazingly, or in your city. So that's something to really strive for. I do want to say that some people are saying that it does have a negative effect as well, because entrepreneurs would probably work for those companies and get a lot of money instead of going out and starting their startup. So there is a negative effect. In Israel, it does already exist. Everyone leaves those companies at some point to build their startup. So that's something that is not such a big risk. And the benefits here are used. And the last recommendation is to track the momentum and recent trend of your startup ecosystem so you can make decision-making, smart decision-making as a government. So you want to know what's going on. One of the things that we're doing in StartupBlink, for example, is offering governments mapping solutions so they can kind of get control of their local map and kind of see which startups are adding themselves, which industries are growing, and so on and so on, and that's super helpful. So the idea is that the government has some kind of responsibility of tracking data as well.